Now let's turn to quantitative variables. So this first data set is somewhat new. So I'm the treasurer for the Big Rapids homeless shelter, Our Brother's Keeper. So this data, this is real data. This comes from our revenue so far up through August 2021 from various donations from various sources, as well as what our annual target, what we're hoping to reach by the end of the year. So you can kind of see in the data, first of all, one thing I want to point out is I turned these into dollars in the Excel file the same way with percents. Right? You just, in the home menu, you just select the dollar, that's accounting format, and this dash means 0. Now let's say I want to make a graph of this. In fact, we've been talking about constructing a dashboard for the board as part of my regular reporting process. So we want to graph this, and what we notice, these are quantitative variables, but notice they're varying among categories. So it's almost like you can think of column A as an input variable, and columns B and C as different output variables. In this case, because the input variables are categorical, and more importantly, because there's not very many of them, this is another place where we might want to make a bar chart. Now, in this case, I'm going to highlight everything, because one of the things we'd like to be able to do is look at the chart and compare current revenue to this point in time to our annual target. And Excel will make a double bar graph that does that, that allows you to make that comparison visually, and it will give you several options to choose from in the recommended charts selection. So let's take a look at what they have. So this is their version of a bar chart. If you look closely, it's probably hard to see in the video, but we've got along the left-hand side private donations, organization donations, all the categories we want. There's also something called a stacked bar chart. So in this example, the full bar represents our target, and then the portion covered in blue represents what we've already had. This is what I think of with a bar chart, a double bar chart, vertically oriented bars. And you can do that with stacked bars as well. They're also giving us a scatter plot. Take a look at that picture. That doesn't do you any good, right? You can't really tell much from that. So I'd say a bar chart is where we want to go. So if we select, here's the traditional bar chart, right? Even though Excel calls it a column chart. Okay. We'll talk about giving this a title in a little bit, but take a look. We can tell right away if we look at this that we're doing fantastic with foundation and trust grants, reasonably okay with private donations. Church contributions we're doing quite well at as well. But business donation and organization donations are lacking. We've actually had no business donations. This was really useful in our last board meeting because we talked about, okay, we need to go out and start talking to businesses and organizations to try to raise funds. Let's look at the stacked bar chart. This is something that, and I'm going to use vertical bars instead of horizontal bars. This is another way to make the same comparison. So there's a bit of a problem with the stacked bar chart. What the stacked bar chart shows you is this blue region is what we've collected. The orange portion is what our target was, and the blue portion does not cover any portion of the orange part. So it looks as if our foundation and trust grant progress has been a little under halfway where we want to go. Whereas we know from the bar chart we made, that's actually not the case. So the stacked bar chart is not a useful chart for this data and our purposes here. Let's look at another data set. This data has to do with a problem in Western China called sometimes people are starting to call this a genocide, the way the Chinese government has treated the Uyghur population, who are a minority Muslim population in the province of Xinjiang in Western China. They've been rounded up and put in camps, and you know, you're starting to hear the word genocide thrown around. This data tracks complaints to a certain agency, and it tracks when those complaints were first registered. So here's how to read this data, these data. In column A, we have a period of time during which when a certain number of complaints came in. It's coded, and you can see the code here, Y, 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 Q, Q. The Y stands for years, 4 digits for years, and then two digits for the quarter. Could be 1 digit, but this is coded with 2 digits. So 201701 means the year 2017, first quarter, which is January 1 through March 31st. During that period, there were 282 initial reports. That's a total of 282 because this is the beginning of the measurement. And you'll see that's 8% of the total samples. Quarter 2, there were 656 initial reports. Add them together, you've got 938, and that's 27% of the total cumulative, and so on. So this is all quantitative data, and arguably the A column is also quantitative and not categorical because time flows as a quantity, although we're measuring it in chunks. So you could use something called a histogram for this. Histograms are often used for quantitative data. Well, we might talk about that in the end in the last chapter. Excel does not do histograms, but we're going to talk about coding software called R that could do histograms well. So I haven't decided if we're going to talk about that at that point or not. But I would say, especially since the input variable here is time, but I would say even when you just have a large number of input variables, and the bars will get kind of crowded, make a line chart. If we want to make a line chart, right away we're going to see a little problem. This chart doesn't look quite right. That's what a line chart would look like. If we let it make the chart, we're going to see that what's happening here is Excel is confused by our input variables. So let's delete that, and I'll show you how to get around it. The way to get around that is I'm just going to make a line chart with the output values, right, the number of cases, or the number of initial reports each quarter. And I'll go ahead and make that chart. And now what I'd like is the bottom axis, the horizontal axis, to have labels that correspond to the various quarters. I'm going to select the horizontal axis. I'm going to right click. That's what you do with a Windows machine. I think there's an equivalent for a Mac. And up here it says select data. So I'm going to click on that. This little box comes up. Okay? So what I'm going to do here, it says horizontal axis labels. I'm going to select edit, and here's the cool thing. I can just select the labels from the Excel file. So I'm holding the shift key down right now and using the arrow to select my labels. That looks good. And now I have what I'm looking for. Right? So you can see the number of initial reports went up, hung around at high levels for a little while, then started to slow down. Let's make a graph of the cumulative problems. We're going to do the same thing. I'm going to highlight the data, whoops, just the output values, and I'm going to go in, and this time I know I want a line graph, and I like them with the little dots for the data points, since the data points really are discrete. And as before, I'm going to select the horizontal axis, right-click, select data, and this edit over there, and now I'll highlight the time values. You could even convert these time values in column A into text, so it's more so a reader doesn't have to decode what's along the axis. All right, whoops. So let's compare these two. One of the things that's worth noticing is that this number is always positive, right? There's never a negative number of problems. But as this number, the initial number of problems declines, the cumulative problems are flattening out. Well, that makes sense because the cumulative problems, what we're doing here is we're adding up the values each of these data points. So as these data points on the left, the initial number of problems gets smaller, the difference between the number of cumulative problems reported gets smaller and the line graph gets flatter. That's also something you can see from line graphs. You can look at the difference between change and accumulation. The graph on the left tells you how the graph on the right changes. The graph on the right tells you how the values in the graph on the left accumulates. Let's look at one more example. In this example, we have the poverty rate and the obesity rate in every county in the state of Michigan. In the previous two examples, whatever our input value was, so we're going to try and compare the obesity rate, the poverty rate, as if the poverty rate is the input value. The question we're wondering is whether or not poverty drives obesity. In the previous examples, given a value of the input variable, there was only one value of the output variable. So for the donations to Our Brother's Keeper, given a grant category, there was only a certain amount of, there was only $1 figure. In the example with the Uyghurs, given a time period, there was only one number of reports filed during that time period. But now in this example, you could imagine two counties have the same poverty rate, 13.5, but a different obesity rate, 22.5 and something else. So a line graph will look weird because you'll get all these horizontal bits. I mean, let's see what happens. I'm going to leave the counties out of this. But if I highlight all of these data and try and make a line graph, let's see what comes up with the suggestions. So Excel really doesn't want to make a single line graph out of this, right, in their suggestions. Let's force it to. It does not. And the reason is because you get all kinds of weird vertical lines if we actually were able to successfully make it, when two counties have the same poverty rate but different obesity rates. So instead, Excel's really pushing the scatter plot. Right? So the scatter plot tells us, it just plots each pair, right? And this allows us to say, is there a relationship between poverty and obesity? That's going to require some caution, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit.